Vorkuta was never meant to hear voices raised in protest. It was built for isolation, a city beyond the Arctic Circle, surrounded by tundra, snow, and distance. A place where escape was impossible not because of walls, but because of geography. Even free men rarely left. Prisoners never did. By the early 1950s, the Vorkuta labor camp complex was one of the largest in the Soviet Union. Tens of thousands of inmates worked in coal mines under conditions that combined extreme cold, chronic hunger, and constant exhaustion. Accidents were common. Illness was routine. Death was unremarkable. The system functioned through repetition: wake up, count, march, work, return. Silence was not enforced loudly. It was assumed. For years, prisoners had learned that resistance achieved nothing. Complaints disappeared into paperwork. Appeals were answered with punishment. Individual defiance was absorbed and erased. What changed in 1953 was not the system. It was expectation. In March of that year, Joseph Stalin died. The announcement reached Vorkuta days later, passed quietly through guards, whispered through barracks, carried from camp to camp, without official confirmation. For many prisoners, the news landed like a shockwave. Stalin had been the fixed point around which the entire Lagerное Systema revolved. His death introduced something the camps had not known for decades: uncertainty at the top. Rumors followed immediately: amnesties, reviews of cases, relaxation of regimes, an end to arbitrary sentences. Some of these rumors had partial foundations, others were pure speculation. In the camps, the difference mattered less than the possibility itself. Prisoners began to talk more openly, not about escape, not about overthrow, about conditions, about food rations that had not improved despite record coal output, about work norms that increased while bodies weakened, about punishments that no longer seemed justified in a changing political climate. The idea that nothing could ever change, the core principle of camp discipline, began to crack. At first, the administration noticed only small deviations: delays in work formation, slower movement to the mines, groups lingering after roll call. None of it looked dangerous, but something fundamental was shifting. For the first time in years, prisoners across different lagera in Vorkuta began to act not as isolated individuals, but as a collective. Information moved between barracks. Decisions were discussed. A shared understanding emerged. If there was ever a moment to speak, this was it. The demands were limited. No overthrow of the state. No destruction of the camps. They asked for reduced work norms, for improved food, for a review of sentences, especially for those convicted under wartime laws. From the perspective of the system, this was already too much. The camps were designed to extract labor, not negotiate. Any coordinated refusal to work, regardless of motive, was treated as a threat to order. In late July 1953, prisoners in several Vorkuta camps did something that had not happened on this scale before. They stopped working. Coal production halted. Mines stood silent. The routine collapsed. For the administration, this was no longer a disciplinary issue. It was an uprising, whether armed or not. And the system knew only one way to respond. The refusal to work was not spontaneous. It unfolded gradually, camp by camp, barrack by barrack. In some sections, prisoners simply did not line up for the morning march to the mines. In others, work brigades descended into the shafts, but refused to begin extraction. There were no barricades, no attacks on guards, no weapons. The strike was quiet, and for that reason, deeply unsettling. The entire Vorkuta camp complex existed for one purpose: coal. Every regulation, every punishment, every incentive was structured around maintaining production. When labor stopped, the system lost its foundation. Camp administrators attempted to respond using standard procedures. Individual prisoners were summoned. Ringleaders were searched for. Threats were issued. Promises were made. In some cases, minor concessions were discussed informally. None of it worked. The refusals spread too widely and too evenly. It became clear that isolating a few individuals would not restore control. Entire barracks remained seated. Entire shifts refused to descend underground. The administration faced a dilemma. Using force immediately risked escalation and casualties on a scale that would be difficult to conceal. Doing nothing risked encouraging similar actions in other camps. For several days, the situation remained suspended. Negotiations were attempted, but they were not conducted on equal terms. Prisoners were addressed collectively, often through loudspeakers or intermediaries. Officials emphasized discipline, legality, and the dangers of disobedience. They reminded inmates that refusal to work constituted a serious crime. The response from the prisoners was restrained but firm. They reiterated their demands. They insisted on written guarantees. They refused to resume work without concrete changes. One of the most striking aspects of the protest was its organization. Despite the absence of formal leadership, prisoners established internal coordination. Information was shared quickly. Decisions were discussed openly within barracks. There was an unspoken agreement to avoid violence and provocation. This discipline was not ideological. It was practical. Many prisoners understood that any act of aggression would justify immediate repression. Their strategy relied on moral contrast, unarmed men refusing labor versus an armed system dependent on it. From the perspective of camp authorities, this was unacceptable. The Soviet Lagerная Sistema was not designed to tolerate passive resistance. Its logic assumed that pressure would always flow in one direction, from administration to prisoner. The idea that inmates could collectively withhold labor challenged that assumption. As days passed, coal output dropped significantly. Reports were sent to regional authorities. From there, they moved upward. What began as a local disturbance was now being discussed at higher levels of government. The language in official communications changed. Prisoners were no longer described as dissatisfied workers. They were labeled instigators, organizers, political elements exploiting the post-Stalin transition. The possibility that their demands might be legitimate was excluded from consideration. By the end of July, the situation in Vorkuta was no longer viewed as a labor dispute. It was classified as a threat to state security. That classification narrowed the range of possible responses dramatically. Once a protest crossed that threshold, compromise became impossible. The system had to reassert control, not only in Vorkuta, but as a warning to every other camp watching closely. Preparations began. Additional forces were requested. Command structures were clarified. Contingency plans were drafted. Prisoners sensed the shift. Guards became less communicative. Patrols increased. The atmosphere hardened. The temporary space for negotiation closed quietly, without announcement. The refusal to work had lasted longer than anyone expected, and the system was preparing to end it. From the outside, the situation in Vorkuta still appeared contained. There were no riots, no fires, no attempts to break through fences. But within the logic of the Lagerная Sistema, the line had already been crossed. Collective refusal to work was not treated as protest. It was treated as rebellion, even without weapons, slogans, or violence. The distinction mattered less than the implication. Prisoners were acting as a unified body, independent of administrative control. That was intolerable. Security reports began reframing the events deliberately. Internal documents avoided words like strike or grievances. Instead, they spoke of organized resistance, hostile elements, and anti-state agitation. This language served a purpose. By redefining the refusal as political rebellion, the authorities justified transferring responsibility from camp administration to security forces. Once that transfer occurred, the rules changed. Negotiation was no longer an option. Inside the camps, prisoners felt the shift before it was announced. Guards stopped engaging in conversation. Orders became shorter, colder. Barracks were searched more frequently. Meetings were prohibited. Isolation replaced uncertainty. At the same time, the protest held. In several key camps within the Vorkuta complex, work remained halted. Prisoners gathered in open areas, sitting or standing in groups, deliberately visible. They did not disperse when ordered. They did not attack. They waited. This waiting was strategic. Many prisoners believed that restraint was their strongest protection. As long as they remained unarmed and nonviolent, they assumed the authorities would hesitate to use lethal force. That assumption underestimated the system they were confronting. For the leadership overseeing the response, the concern was no longer limited to Vorkuta. Other lagerai across the Soviet Union were watching closely. Information traveled faster than official channels could suppress it. If Vorkuta succeeded in forcing concessions, the precedent would spread. From that perspective, the outcome in Vorkuta mattered more than the number of prisoners involved. It became an example that could not be allowed to stand. Orders moved downward through command structures, increasingly specific, but still deliberately indirect. Responsibility was distributed across multiple levels, ensuring that no single figure could later be isolated as the author of repression. Troops were placed on alert. Units of internal security were transferred closer to the camps. Ammunition was issued, vehicles were positioned. Training exercises were reframed as readiness drills. None of this was visible to the prisoners directly. What they saw was stillness, a tense calm stretched over days. They heard rumors of reinforcements. They noticed unfamiliar faces among the guards. They sensed that the window for resolution was closing. Yet the protest continued. The refusal to work had become more than a tactic. It was a statement that even within a system built to erase individuality, collective action was possible. For the authorities, this made the situation more dangerous, not less. A system that relies on fear cannot allow fear to be questioned. By the beginning of August, the decision had effectively been made. The protest would end. Order would be restored. The remaining question was not whether force would be used. It was how openly. The decision was not made in a single moment. It emerged gradually through reports, assessments, and internal correspondence that framed the situation in increasingly rigid terms. What began as a problem of discipline was reclassified as a threat to stability. Once that classification settled, the range of acceptable responses narrowed sharply. At that point, force was no longer an option among others. It became the solution. Responsibility shifted away from camp administrators to internal security structures. The logic was procedural. Administrators managed labor. Security forces handled threats. The refusal to work, sustained and collective, had crossed the boundary between the two. Orders were issued to prepare for a decisive intervention. Additional troops were brought in from outside the region. Units unfamiliar with the prisoners were preferred. Distance reduced hesitation. These forces had no prior relationships with inmates, no shared routines, no informal understandings built over years of daily contact. They were there to restore order. Planning focused on separation. The camps involved in the protest were identified. Prisoners were categorized by perceived influence. The goal was to isolate, fragment, and overwhelm. Open areas where inmates gathered were marked as priority zones. Commanders discussed methods to disperse crowds quickly and prevent regrouping. Warnings were considered. They were also dismissed. Authorities understood that issuing explicit warnings would acknowledge the legitimacy of the protest as something that could be negotiated. Instead, instructions emphasized speed and control. The situation was to be resolved before it could evolve further. Inside the camps, signs of the coming intervention were visible. Prisoners noticed increased guard rotations. Observation towers were fully staffed. Weapons were no longer concealed. Vehicles moved into positions that blocked exits and internal pathways. Still, no announcement was made. This silence served a purpose. It preserved the element of surprise and minimized the opportunity for prisoners to organize a coordinated response. Any delay, any visible debate, risked reinforcing the idea that resistance could shape outcomes. From the perspective of command, clarity was essential. The camps were not to become a space of negotiation. They were to be reasserted as spaces of control. On the morning chosen for the operation, prisoners gathered as they had on previous days. Some expected renewed talks. Others anticipated punishment, but not its scale. Few believed that lethal force would be used against unarmed inmates. That belief rested on a misunderstanding. The authorities did not view the situation in moral terms. They viewed it structurally. A system designed to compel labor had encountered organized refusal. If that refusal was not broken decisively, the system itself would be undermined. In that calculation, individual lives carried little weight. Commands were finalized, units took their positions, communication channels were secured, medical teams were placed on standby, not for the prisoners, but for personnel. The operation was ready. What followed would end the protest, and it would do so in a way that left no ambiguity about where power ultimately resided. The operation began without announcement. There were no final warnings delivered to the prisoners, no attempt to restate demands or reopen negotiations. The moment for dialogue had already passed. What followed was a coordinated use of force designed to end collective resistance as quickly as possible. Security units entered the camps simultaneously. In the areas where prisoners had been gathering openly, troops moved to establish control over space. Movement corridors were blocked. Observation towers were fully manned. Orders were issued to disperse groups and force inmates back into barracks. At first, prisoners did not immediately react. Many believed this was another intimidation tactic. Some expected arrests or beatings. The idea that lethal force would be used against unarmed inmates still seemed unlikely to them. That assumption proved fatal. When prisoners refused to disperse, force was applied. Accounts differ on the exact sequence, but the outcome is consistent across testimonies. Weapons were used. Gunfire was directed into groups of inmates. Panic spread instantly. Some prisoners attempted to flee, others froze. The open spaces that had served as sites of collective protest became traps, offering little cover and no escape routes. The geography of the camps, fences, watchtowers, controlled pathways, worked against those inside. The firing was not prolonged, but it was decisive. Within minutes, resistance collapsed. Those who were not wounded were forced back into barracks or onto the ground. Guards moved through the area, separating prisoners, identifying individuals, restoring physical control of the camps. Casualties were removed quickly. The official response minimized the scale of what had occurred. Reports described the use of force as limited and necessary. Numbers were reduced. Language was sanitized. Independent verification was impossible. What is known comes from survivor accounts and later archival research. These sources indicate that dozens of prisoners were killed and many more wounded. Some died immediately. Others succumbed to injuries later without formal acknowledgement. Medical treatment was restricted. Wounded prisoners were treated under guard. Access to outside facilities was limited. Records were incomplete or deliberately altered. Families were not informed. Deaths were registered under vague causes. The protest was over. Coal production resumed shortly afterward. Work brigades returned to the mines. The routine reasserted itself with mechanical efficiency. From the perspective of the administration, order had been restored. From the perspective of the prisoners, a line had been crossed. The refusal to work had ended not because demands were addressed, but because resistance had been met with overwhelming force. The lesson was unambiguous. Collective action would be answered collectively. The camps fell silent again. But the silence was different. It was no longer based on habit or resignation. It was imposed through memory, through the knowledge of what had happened to those who stood in open space and refused to move. The system had reasserted itself. At a cost, it would not record honestly. The suppression in Vorkuta was not followed by public explanation. There were no official statements, no acknowledgments of casualties, no announcements addressed to the wider population. What had happened inside the camps was treated as an internal matter, resolved and closed. The Lagerneia Sistema returned to routine. Work schedules were reinstated. Guards resumed standard rotations. Administrative reports emphasized restored order and normalized production levels. Any reference to the protest was removed from operational summaries or reduced to technical language. The dead were not commemorated. Their bodies were buried without ceremony. In many cases, burial sites were unmarked or deliberately obscured. Families were not informed of the circumstances. Some were told nothing at all. Others received notices that omitted cause or location. For the living, consequences followed quietly. Participants identified as organizers or influential figures were isolated. Some were transferred to other camps. Others received additional sentences. Surveillance increased. Collective gatherings were prohibited. The informal networks that had sustained the protest were dismantled. Fear resumed its function. Outside Vorkuta, the events were not discussed publicly. Newspapers remained silent. Radio broadcasts made no mention of unrest. Official histories of the period skipped directly from Stalin's death to administrative reforms, leaving the camps out of the narrative. Yet the story did not disappear. It survived in fragments, in whispered recollections, in cautious conversations years later, in memories passed between former prisoners who rarely spoke openly. For decades, these accounts existed without confirmation, unsupported by documents and dismissed by authorities. Only much later did archival material begin to surface. Even then, the record was incomplete. Documents contradicted one another. Numbers varied. Responsibility remained diffuse. The structure that had enabled the violence protected itself from clear attribution. The Vorkuta uprising was acknowledged, but never fully examined. It did not become a symbol. It did not prompt reform. It did not alter the logic of the system. It marked a boundary. The brief moment after Stalin's death, when uncertainty had created space for hope, closed abruptly. The response in Vorkuta demonstrated that the mechanisms of repression remained intact, capable of acting decisively even without a single figure at the center. The camps continued to operate, the mines continued to extract coal, and the silence returned, reinforced by the knowledge of what happened when it was broken.